You're a German Wehrmacht soldier manning an anti-aircraft position outside Stalingrad, August 1942. It's 2:30 a.m. You've been on duty for 6 hours, exhausted, freezing despite summer heat during the day, scanning black skies for Soviet bombers. Your unit has been under constant harassment for 3 nights. Small bombing raids every hour, sometimes multiple times per hour, preventing anyone from sleeping, destroying supplies, killing soldiers with precise bomb drops that shouldn't be possible from the altitude these aircraft fly. Then you hear it. That sound. The sound that's been driving German soldiers insane across the Eastern Front. A soft whooshing, like wind through fabric, like something gliding through air without engines. Your searchlight operator swings the beam toward the sound and catches it briefly. A small biplane, wood and canvas, ancient-looking, flying maybe 100 meters above ground. Before anyone can fire, it releases bombs. 2 small explosions that destroy an ammunition truck 50 meters away, and the plane banks hard, disappearing into darkness before your gunners can track it. 3 minutes later, another plane. Same sound, same low altitude. 2 more bombs. This time, they hit the field kitchen, killing the cooks preparing tomorrow's breakfast. You fire blindly into darkness. You hear the plane's engine start back up as it climbs away. You've hit nothing. 4 minutes later, another one, then another, then another. All night long, these planes come in sequence, one after another, bombing, disappearing, returning. Your unit fires thousands of rounds into the sky. You've hit nothing. By dawn, you've counted 18 separate bombing runs. 18. From what sounds like the same 3 planes cycling through attacks continuously. Your sergeant is screaming about witches. He's convinced Soviet women are flying these planes because male pilots couldn't be this precise, this fearless, or this insane. He's probably drunk. Everyone's been drinking to cope with the psychological torture of these night raids. But when captured Soviet documents are translated weeks later, you learn he was right. They are women. All of them. Young women, mostly teenagers and early 20s, flying wood and canvas biplanes from 1928 with no radios, no guns, no parachutes, bombing German positions 8 to 18 times per night, every night for months. The Germans start calling them Nachthexen, night witches. The name spreads. Any soldier who shoots one down gets an Iron Cross. Not because shooting down one ancient biplane is particularly difficult, but because these women are driving entire Wehrmacht divisions insane, and German high command wants them stopped. You've been fighting for 2 years. You faced Soviet tanks, artillery, winter offensives that froze men solid. But nothing has terrified you like the sound of those planes gliding through darkness, invisible until bombs start exploding. The numbers told a story that Wehrmacht intelligence found impossible to believe. The 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, an all-female unit flying obsolete Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, flew over 30,000 combat sorties between 1942 and 1945, dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs, and maintained an operational tempo that exceeded most male bomber units. Each pilot flew an average of 800 to 1,000 combat missions over 4 years of continuous warfare. By comparison, British and American bomber crews were rotated out after 25-30 missions because the psychological and physical toll was considered unsustainable beyond that point. But the Night Witches weren't following anyone else's rules. They flew 8-18 missions per night, every night, taking off and landing every 3 minutes in continuous rotation. Their planes were so slow, maximum speed 94 mph, that German fighters couldn't effectively engage them because the fighters would stall trying to match the PO-2's speed. Their aircraft were made of plywood and canvas, so radar had difficulty detecting them. And they employed a tactic that drove German soldiers insane. They'd cut their engines near the target and glide silently toward the bomb release point, with only the sound of wind whistling through wing struts to give them away. Germans swore it sounded like witches on broomsticks. Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Vasilyevna Popova was one of the most effective pilots in the 588th Regiment, and her record exemplifies why German soldiers feared these women so intensely. Over 4 years of combat, she flew 852 missions, more sorties than almost any other Soviet pilot, male or female. Her plane was shot up 42 times, forcing crash landings, emergency repairs, and flights home with aircraft barely holding together. She survived multiple wounds, including shrapnel injuries that should have killed her. And on one legendary night in June 1943, she flew 18 separate bombing missions between sunset and sunrise, 18 round trips to German positions, 36 landings and takeoffs, 36 bombs dropped, all in darkness, in a plane with no instruments beyond a compass and altimeter. Military analysts studying her record after the war couldn't understand how one person sustained that operational tempo without psychological breakdown, physical collapse, or simple mathematical probability catching up and killing her. The answer, according to Popova herself in interviews decades later, was simple. We fought because our country was being destroyed. My home was taken by Germans who turned it into a Gestapo station. My brother was killed at the front. Every bomb I dropped was revenge. I didn't have time to be afraid or tired. I only had time to kill Germans. Nadezhda Popova was born on December 17, 1921, in Shabanovka, Ukraine, into a working-class family. Her father was an engineer, her mother worked in administration. Nadezhda was described as energetic, wild, rebellious, exactly the kind of child who'd grow up to fly bombing missions against the Wehrmacht. At age 15, she joined a flying club, learning to pilot gliders and light aircraft. By 17, she was working as a flight instructor, teaching others to fly. By 19, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, she was an experienced pilot with hundreds of hours of flight time. She immediately volunteered for military service. The Soviet military initially refused her. Women weren't supposed to fly combat missions. Women could be nurses, communications operators, support staff, but not pilots dropping bombs on enemy positions. Nadezhda was told to go home, that the military would call if they needed her. She refused to leave. She camped outside the recruitment office for days, demanding to be accepted as a combat pilot. Other young women did the same. The Soviet Union was facing existential crisis. German forces had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, captured millions of soldiers, and were advancing toward Moscow. The Red Army was desperately short of trained personnel, equipment, and time. Women volunteering to fly combat missions shouldn't have been rejected. They should have been celebrated. But bureaucracy and prejudice nearly kept Nadezhda and hundreds of other qualified female pilots out of combat. That changed because of one woman, Marina Raskova, a legendary Soviet aviator who'd set multiple distance records in the 1930s and had Stalin's ear. Raskova lobbied the Soviet leader personally, arguing that trained female pilots were a resource the nation couldn't afford to waste. Women had proven they could fly as well as men. The Soviet Union needed pilots. Gender was irrelevant. On October 8, 1941, Stalin issued an order authorizing the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Nadezhda Popova, 19 years old, was among the first volunteers accepted into the 588th Regiment. Training was brutal. The women were expected to learn in months what male pilots were given years to master: night navigation without instruments, precision bombing from low altitude, evasive maneuvers, emergency procedures, survival skills. They trained in Engels, a city on the Volga River, through the winter of 1941-1942, one of the coldest winters in Soviet history. They flew in temperatures reaching 40 degrees, in planes without heating, without closed cockpits, with minimal protective clothing. Their aircraft were Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, 2-wing planes designed in 1928 as primary trainers and crop dusters. These were not combat aircraft. They had no armor, no defensive weapons, no radios, no radar, and often no parachutes because adding parachutes meant reducing bomb load. Maximum speed was 94 mm. Maximum ceiling was approximately 10,000 feet. The planes were constructed from plywood frames covered in canvas fabric treated with cellulose lacquer, highly flammable materials that would ignite if hit by tracer bullets. The women asked why they were being given these obsolete planes instead of modern bombers. The answer was brutally pragmatic. These were the only planes available. The Soviet Air Force had lost thousands of aircraft in the early months of the war. Modern planes were assigned to male units flying daylight missions. The women would fly at night at low altitude, where speed and altitude didn't matter as much as precision and courage. The night witches embraced the limitation and turned it into advantage. The PO-2's slow speed made it nearly impossible for German fighters to engage effectively. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would stall if they slowed enough to match the PO-2's speed. The plane's wood and canvas construction made it largely invisible to radar, and flying at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 meters above ground, meant German anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to target them effectively. But the real innovation was the glide bombing tactic. The Po-2's engine was loud. German soldiers could hear it from miles away, giving them warning to take cover. So the night witches developed a technique. They'd fly toward the target area with engine running, then cut the engine several hundred meters away and glide silently toward the bomb release point. The only sound was wind whistling through wing struts and control wires, a soft whooshing that German soldiers swore sounded like a witch's broomstick cutting through air. They'd release their bombs, 2 small 50-kilogram bombs, one under each wing, then restart the engine and climb away into darkness while German troops were still reacting to the explosions. By the time searchlights swept the sky and anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the night witch was already gone, circling back to base for the next load of bombs. Nadezhda Popova flew her first combat mission on March 10, 1942. She was assigned as a pilot with a navigator named Katya Ryabova sitting in the rear cockpit. Their target was a German supply depot near the front lines in Ukraine, Nadezhda's home region, now occupied by Wehrmacht forces. The mission was terrifying. Flying at night without instruments, navigating by compass and landmarks barely visible in darkness, approaching enemy positions defended by searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, knowing that one hit from tracer fire would turn her plane into a fireball. She later described feeling like she was flying into hell. But she also described feeling satisfaction when her bombs hit the target and explosions lit up the German depot. She'd struck back against the enemy that had invaded her country, killed her brother, and stolen her home. That feeling, revenge, justice, purpose, sustained her through 851 more missions. Not all missions succeeded. During that first night of operations, 2 of Nadezhda's fellow pilots were shot down and killed, the first casualties of the 588th Regiment. Nadezhda watched their planes burn, watched them fall from the sky, knew those women had been alive minutes ago and were now dead. When she landed back at base, she expected time to mourn, to process the loss, to recover psychologically. Instead, she was immediately assigned another mission. There was no time for grief. The war continued whether individual soldiers were ready or not. She flew again that same night, and again the night after, and every night for the next 3 years. The operational tempo was inhuman. Each crew, pilot and navigator, would fly 8 to 10 missions per night as standard procedure. On busy nights, when German forces were concentrated or major offensives were underway, they'd fly 12-15 missions. And on extraordinary nights like that June 1943 mission when Nadezhda flew 18 sorties, they'd push themselves beyond what should have been physically possible. Each mission followed the same pattern: take off from temporary airfield, fly 10-20 kilometers to target area, cut engine and glide to bombing point, release bombs, restart engine and climb away while Germans fired at them, return to base, land, taxi to reloading area where ground crew, also all women, would attach new bombs to the wings, refuel the plane if necessary, then take off again within 3 to 5 minutes. All night long, every night. The physical toll was devastating. Flying in open cockpits at 40 degrees gave every pilot frostbite. Constant exposure to engine noise damaged hearing. Breathing cold air for hours caused respiratory infections. The stress and sleep deprivation created psychological damage that manifested as nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness. But the Night Witches kept flying because stopping meant letting Germans advance unchallenged. The legend of the 18 bombing missions in one night happened on June 23, 1943, during the height of the Kursk Offensive, the largest tank battle in history, where German and Soviet forces were locked in desperate combat that would determine the war's direction. German forces had concentrated near Novocherkass, planning a major armor push. Soviet high command needed that concentration disrupted. The Night Witches were ordered to fly maximum sorties, keep German troops awake, destroy supplies, prevent them from resting before the attack. Nadezhda Popova and her navigator Katya Ryabova were assigned to the operation. Standard procedure was 8 to 10 missions per night. But this night was different. Every available aircraft was flying continuously. Ground crews were working at maximum speed to reload, refuel, and launch planes in 3-minute intervals. Nadezhda's first mission that night was straightforward. Fly 15 kilometers to German positions, drop 2 50-kilogram bombs on a supply depot, return to base. The flight took 35 minutes round trip. She landed, taxied to the reload area where ground crew attached new bombs to her wings and added fuel, then took off again within 4 minutes. Mission 2 was identical. Different target, same procedure. Then Mission 3. Then 4. By the 8th mission, standard maximum for even experienced pilots, Nadezhda was exhausted. She'd been flying for 6 hours straight. Her hands were numb from cold despite summer temperatures during the day. At altitude in an open cockpit at night, temperatures dropped below freezing. Her face was covered in frostbite. Her eyes burned from strain of flying in darkness with only a compass and altimeter as instruments. But German positions were still active. Soviet command needed more harassment, more disruption, more bombs. Nadezhda was asked if she could continue flying. She said yes, not because she felt physically capable, she was operating on adrenaline and willpower, but because stopping meant German soldiers would rest, resupply, and attack Soviet positions at dawn. Mission 9 was harder. Fatigue was affecting her navigation. She overshot the target area and had to circle back, exposing herself to searchlights and anti-aircraft fire longer than normal. Mission 10 was worse. She nearly missed the airfield returning to base, landing only after multiple attempts to locate the rough field in complete darkness. Between missions 10 and 11, Nadezhda's commander ordered her to rest. She refused. "My navigator and I can keep flying. Every bomb we don't drop is one more German truck that survives to kill Soviet soldiers tomorrow." The commander reluctantly approved, continuing. Missions 11 through 14 became a blur of exhaustion. Nadezhda later described flying on autopilot, her body performing actions her conscious mind was too tired to fully process. Take off. Navigate to target by compass bearing and landmarks barely visible in darkness. Cut engine. Glide toward target. Release bombs when navigator taps shoulder. Restart engine. Fly home. Land. Repeat. On mission 15, her plane was hit. Tracer rounds from German anti-aircraft guns found her PO2 as she climbed away from the target. She felt the impacts, sharp cracks as bullets punctured canvas and plywood. Her navigator screamed that they'd been hit. Nadezhda kept flying. The plane was still controllable. The engine was still running. She landed back at base expecting to find catastrophic damage. The ground crew counted 14 bullet holes, 14 penetrations through canvas skin and plywood frame that had somehow missed fuel tanks, control cables, and both crew members. One round had passed through Nadezhda's map. Another had grazed her leather helmet without penetrating. The plane was still flyable. Ground crew patched the worst holes with fabric and glue, repairs that took maybe 10 minutes, and reloaded the bombs. Mission 16 was flown in an aircraft held together partially by emergency repairs and luck. Mission 17 pushed Nadezhda past what she thought was her physical limit. She was hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing lights that didn't exist, feeling the plane bank when it was flying level, experiencing time distortions where seconds felt like minutes. On Mission 18, her final sortie that night, Nadezhda made a mistake that should have killed her. Approaching the target, exhausted beyond rational thought, she forgot to cut her engine before beginning the glide bomb approach. The Germans heard her coming, activated searchlights, and opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun in the sector. Her plane was immediately caught in searchlight beams, completely illuminated, a perfect target. Tracer fire converged from multiple directions. Nadezhda threw the Po-2 into a violent bank, trying to escape the searchlights. Bullets ripped through the aircraft. She felt impacts all around her, through wings, through tail surfaces, past the cockpit. Her navigator was screaming. Nadezhda released the bombs without proper aim, just dropped them to reduce weight, and dove toward the ground at maximum speed, which for a Po-2 was still only 94 km but felt suicidal in an open cockpit aircraft. She escaped the searchlights by flying so low that she was below the anti-aircraft gun's minimum depression angle, literally skimming treetops at 50 feet altitude in total darkness, praying she wouldn't hit a hill or building. When she finally climbed back to safe altitude and headed for base, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control the aircraft. She landed just before dawn, the 18th landing of the night. When she shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, she collapsed. Her legs wouldn't support her weight. Ground crew carried her to the medical tent where doctors found she was suffering from severe exhaustion, frostbite on her face and hands, and psychological shock from hours of continuous combat stress. The doctor ordered her grounded for 48 hours minimum. She was back flying the next night. The war didn't allow recovery time. German forces were still advancing. Soviet forces were still dying. The night witches were still needed. When her plane was examined in daylight after that 18th mission, ground crew counted the damage, 42 bullet holes, 42 penetrations through a plane made of plywood and canvas. Bullets had passed through both wings, through the tail section, through the fuselage inches from where Nadezhda and Katya had been sitting. Multiple control cables had been partially severed. One or two more hits in the wrong place would have made the aircraft uncontrollable. One bullet had punched through Nadezhda's map, the one she'd been reading minutes before the attack. Another had scraped her leather helmet, leaving a groove but not penetrating. The plane was declared combat-worthy after repairs. That Po-2, tail number not recorded in surviving documents but likely one of the early production aircraft delivered to the 588th in 1942, flew dozens more missions before being finally destroyed in a landing accident in late 1943. German prisoners of war captured during the Kursk offensive and subsequent Soviet advances were sometimes interrogated about their experiences with Soviet air attacks. When asked specifically about the night witches, responses ranged from grudging respect to genuine terror. One captured Wehrmacht corporal, interviewed in August 1943, described the psychological impact. Every night these planes came, small aircraft sounding like cloth ripping, like wind through trees. You couldn't see them. You'd hear the sound, then bombs would explode, then another plane, then another. All night long, no rest, no sleep. Men became paranoid. They'd hear any noise, wind, birds, engine in the distance, and think it was the witches coming back. Some men refused to sleep outdoors. They'd crowd into bunkers meant for half as many people because they felt safer underground, even though the bunkers were more dangerous if bombed. Another German POW, a sergeant captured in Ukraine in late 1943, expressed disbelief when told the pilots were women. "I don't believe that. Women couldn't fly combat missions like that. The pilots we fought were too skilled, too aggressive, too fearless. They would fly into searchlights and anti-aircraft fire that made our own Luftwaffe pilots refuse missions. They flew every night, multiple times per night, for months. That requires physical endurance and courage that..." Interview transcript indicates prisoners stopped speaking, possibly unwilling to admit women could possess those qualities. German soldiers who successfully shot down night witches, approximately 30 were killed during the war, were awarded Iron Crosses, Germany's highest military honor. Not because shooting down one obsolete biplane required exceptional skill, but because German high command recognized the psychological value these women had to Soviet forces and the psychological damage they inflicted on German troops. Eliminating a night witch was considered equivalent to destroying a tank or shooting down a modern bomber. But the Iron Crosses offered didn't stop the nightly harassment. The night witches kept flying. Between 1942 and 1945, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, never more than 40 aircraft at any time, flew over 30,000 combat sorties, dropped approximately 23,000 tons of bombs, and maintained an operational tempo that exceeded most male bomber units, despite flying outdated aircraft without armor, weapons, radios, or parachutes. Nadezhda Popova personally flew 852 combat missions over those 4 years, more than any other Soviet pilot except a handful of male fighter pilots who flew shorter, less demanding sorties. Her plane was hit 42 times, counting only that one mission's damage, forced into multiple crash landings, and patched back together by ground crews using fabric, glue, and improvisation. She was wounded multiple times by shrapnel and debris. She survived shoot-downs, crashes, and operational accidents that killed many of her fellow pilots. 23 night witches were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest military honor, for their service. Nadezhda Popova was among them. The award citation specifically mentioned her record of 852 missions, her courage under fire, and her refusal to be grounded even after injuries. But Nadezhda always insisted the real heroes were the 30 pilots who died. Women like those two who crashed during training on her first mission, like her friends shot down by German fighters or anti-aircraft fire, like navigators who burned alive when tracer bullets ignited their canvas aircraft. Post-war life was difficult for Nadezhda and many night witches. They'd been celebrated during wartime as heroes fighting for Soviet survival. But after the war, Soviet society quickly reverted to traditional gender roles. Women were expected to return to domestic life, marriage, children, supporting male breadwinners. Female veterans, especially combat veterans, were often seen as unfeminine, damaged, unmarriageable. Nadezhda married Semyon Kharlamov, her navigator during the war who'd transferred to become a fighter pilot. They had 2 children. She tried to live a normal civilian life, working as a flying instructor, teaching new generations of pilots. But she struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, nightmares about burning planes, hypervigilance triggered by aircraft sounds, survivor's guilt about the friends who died while she lived. She also struggled with being forgotten. The Night Witch's story was suppressed in Soviet historical narratives that emphasized male heroism. Female combat veterans were often left out of official histories, memorial ceremonies, and veterans' benefits. The 588th Regiment's accomplishments were minimized or attributed to male command structures. This changed gradually after the Soviet Union collapsed. In the 1990s and 2000s, historians began seriously researching women's contributions to the Eastern Front. Books, documentaries, and academic papers documented what the Night Witches had accomplished. Nadezhda was interviewed extensively in her later years, finally able to tell her story to audiences who wanted to hear it. In a 2009 interview for PRI's The World, Nadezhda described what motivated her through 852 missions. "We flew in sequence, one after another, and during the night we never let them rest, so they called us night witches. The Germans made up stories. They spread the rumor that we had been injected with some unknown chemicals that enabled us to see so clearly at night. But it wasn't chemicals. It was anger. My home was taken by Germans. My brother was killed. My friends were dying. Every bomb I dropped was revenge." In another interview, she reflected on the toll. "Sometimes I still hear the sound of wind through the Po-2's struts. That soft, whooshing sound we heard every night for 4 years. It was the sound of hunting. We were hunting Germans who'd invaded our country, and every night we found them. That sound meant we were doing our jobs. Even now, 70 years later, when I hear wind through trees, I think about those nights, about the friends who died, about the Germans we killed, about surviving when we shouldn't have. Nadezhda Popova died on July 8, 2013, at age 91 in Moscow. Her obituary in the New York Times called her one of the most celebrated Soviet aviators of World War II. Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a statement honoring her service. The remaining night witches, fewer than 10 still alive by 2013, attended her funeral. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from German veterans who'd fought against her. One elderly Wehrmacht veteran, tracked down by a Russian journalist in 2013 for reactions to Popova's death, said simply, "The night witches were the best pilots we faced. Not because their planes were good, their planes were terrible. Not because they had superior weapons, they had no weapons at all, but because they were fearless. They flew into situations that would make Luftwaffe pilots refuse missions, and they did it every night, for years. That takes courage beyond what most soldiers ever find. I'm glad they were on the Soviet side. If Germany had pilots like that, the war might have ended differently." The night witches flew over 30,000 combat sorties in obsolete planes made of plywood and canvas. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs without radios, radar, or parachutes. They flew 818 missions per night, every night, for months or years, until they died or the war ended. 30 were killed. 23 became heroes of the Soviet Union. And one, Nadezhda Popova, flew 852 missions, survived 42 bullet holes in one night, and proved that courage, skill, and determination matter more than technology or physical strength. German POWs called them Nachthexen, night witches, because they sounded like witches on broomsticks and seemed to appear from nowhere to drop bombs before vanishing into darkness. The name was meant as an insult, a way to dismiss these women as supernatural rather than skilled pilots. But the night witches embraced the name. They wore it as a badge of honor. Because being called a witch by your enemy means you're frightening them. And frightening the Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered most of Europe, was exactly what these young women intended to do. One bombing run at a time. June 23, 1943. 18 bombing missions, 7 hours of continuous flight, 42 bullet holes, one plane held together by canvas and determination, and 2 women, pilot and navigator, who refused to stop flying because stopping meant letting Germans win. That's the story of the night witches. That's the story of Nadezhda Popova, and that's why German soldiers, decades after the war, still remembered the sound of wind through canvas and plywood as the sound of death approaching from darkness they couldn't escape.